being vulnerable isn't necessarily the same thing as spilling your guts. I think a way to nuance it, and you can tell me if you agree or not, is sharing your humanness. Because a lot of people think if they're nervous to give a speech, if they come out and open with, I'm nervous, that the audience is going to feel bad for them and love what they have to say, but it does the opposite. It turns them off. But then you and Vince, when I see your sermons, you'll share something very human or personal, like an experience you had with a friend's child, or maybe something that went a little off when you were working on a funeral service or something. So can you say a little bit about being vulnerable versus alienating your audience?
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I think about, I had a playwriting instructor in undergrad who talked about not now it's kind of gotten bastardized through like the fog of memory. She talked about the audience wanting to know basically that someone's in control, that the thing's not gonna fall apart. The thing that that I have internalized is like I don't then I was a playwright, but I don't want to make the audience feel like they need to take care of me. And I'm not sure that's right. I'm not sure that's right. I think it's in the mix, but I'm not sure it's right because it cuts against, or at least saying it like that could cut against somebody being like, oh, I was going to tell this story, this hard thing. Do you think that makes people feel like they have to take care of me? And sometimes the answer is yes. And sometimes the way I preach is like, does this make people feel like they have to take care of me? Sometimes the answer is yes. Like I've said a thing that's so vulnerable that people are like, hey, did you go get that thing checked out with your doctor? Like,
I know which one you're talking about too.
A lot of people texted me that week and I was like, I'm a grown ass woman. Like I went to the doctor. Okay. But also like I preach this extremely graphic, vulnerable thing. And so a piece that's in the mix for me is something about, so there's structural taking care of. It's one thing for me to preach about like my body failing. I think, I'm just working this out. Like it may be different for me to preach about my body falling apart and people being like, oh no, your body's falling apart, which is to your point of humanness, like regular.
Right.
How's your body? I think it's a different kind of caretaking if I'm asking the audience or listeners, congregation to take care of me in a structural way, which is like, I'm nervous about public speaking, feels like there's a qualitative difference in the care that I'm asking. Like I'm doing a thing. I'm asking you to listen to me for 10 to 15 minutes, but I'm conveying right out of the gate that maybe you shouldn't trust me. And that's not to say people shouldn't be nervous. I don't.
No, you should. That's the thing. It's okay to be nervous, but I think you're right. It is a different kind of structural caretaking versus the human side, because to me, and Randy, I'd love your opinion on this too, and Rebecca, if you start off, what I always tell my clients is don't start off with something that dings your credibility. I'm nervous. I hate public speaking. The other thing I've seen when someone has to step in for their boss, hi, Susan was supposed to do this, but she can't be here. So you're stuck with me and I didn't prepare. They'll just tell the audience, I don't know anything about this, but Susan got sick at the last minute. So now I have to fill in. What do you two think about that? About trying to that's my thing. Don't ding your credibility at the start. So what are your opinions?
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind for me, as it often does, is a Friends reference. There's a moment where Monica is leaving a voicemail for an ex, and she's stumbling through it, and then she says, "I'm being breezy," and Joey says, "You can't say you're breezy. That completely negates the breezy."
Yeah.
And I feel like if you stand up and say, I am about to be vulnerable for 10 minutes, then that is not what you're really looking for. That kind of negates the power of it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I say to people that I learned from the folks at Second Story, Second Story here in Chicago, I learned a lot of storytelling from them. And I don't know how much they even talk about it anymore, but I think the first show that I did with them, they talked about like before you begin the first line of your story speech, that there's, again, what I've internalized is like the moment before, and there's this kind of grounding breath. And I talk about it, folks, and I always give Second Story credit, that I say it's not about you getting authority from the audience. It's you remembering that you have already the listeners like permission. It's as though they have asked you a question, and I do think this is right from Second Story. It's as though the listener has asked you a question, and this is your response. You have authority from them, and they don't need a reminder. You do. because they're sitting there waiting, like it's clear to them that you are about to, like you have their permission, and you have authority. So there's something about, which doesn't mean you can't be nervous. It doesn't mean you can't be vulnerable, but there's something about, so I think about that kind of vulnerability, that kind of structural, like don't make any caveats. Like I want the first line out of your mouth to be the beginning of your story. Like I already did your intro. Just, you're prep. You got it. But I think, and then I think there's another kind of difference to talk about, maybe if it's interesting, is there's a thing about sometimes, especially in these workshops, in part because people have like a go-to narrative, how I got sick and how I got well, how I met my partner, what happened when I found out I got cancer, whatever. I say to folks, don't feel pressure to tell your biggest, hardest story. And in fact, I would discourage you from telling your biggest, hardest story. You don't owe us that. But also, if you continue as a storyteller, you might end up with greater facility down the road, more gently, for your own sake, never mind the listeners, for your own sake or for the listeners, you might end up with more facility to deal with a very tender story. So I also think there's some kind of conversation to be had about that kind of vulnerability. Like you don't owe everybody your bleeding heart. You can tell them part of the story, and I say that doesn't, for my money, make it less true. So I think there's that kind of vulnerability too, where people are like, but if I'm going to tell you, I have to tell you the whole thing, and that's what makes it true. And tell you my whole trauma, which maybe I haven't cooked yet.
And that's a really great point. And I'm taking us a little down the road, but Randy, I know you'll identify with this too. Something Randy and I often share with business clients, especially when they, I feel like when we say, okay, we're going to talk about stories in business or story principles. I usually put the word principles because it sounds more businessy. Because, and Randy, feel free to chime in here. I feel like whenever I'm with an audience, a business audience, and say we're going to learn about stories, they either think it's, once upon a time there were three bears, or they think it has to be this, this client didn't want to buy our product, he did, and now we made $1 million. It doesn't have to be the biggest thing. A simple thing about, we helped one guy in South Dakota find the classes he needed, and he wrote us a thank you note. That was a win I had with the conference but it was amazing. This gentleman who came up, who sought me out and said, I had to come all the way to Chicago to find this class because I can't find it in South Dakota. Thank you. And he was like a repeat client, and that was great. Randy, what are your thoughts on that with the, big story versus just, it can be a tiny thing?
Yeah, and sometimes it might not even be a story at all. I tell people, not to confuse storytelling story time, because as you said, it's not a once upon a time thing necessarily, but it's about pulling those principles that have made storytelling the effective means of communication and the way we connect with each other since cave drawings were stories, and working through ways to incorporate that into how we communicate and present.
I love it.
Love the way that this conversation went. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing your thoughts with us.
Yeah, yes. Much a pleasure.
Saying this was so helpful. I'm going to go back and listen to this and take some notes for my next upcoming speech. So Rebecca, thank you so much for being here today.
You're so welcome. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us on Between Two Speakers. I'm Marianna Swallow.
And I'm Randy Ford. We'll speak with you next time.
Bye-bye.